the most twisted, forbidden ceremonies of Pharaoh Akhenaten, dark history. Picture this: Amarna, Egypt, year 10 of Akhenaten's reign, 1348 BCE. You're a temple scribe, keeper of sacred records for 3 generations. Tonight, you've been summoned to the great temple, but not the public one, the other temple, the one that doesn't appear on any map. As you approach through the moonless dark, you notice something wrong. The air tastes metallic, copper, blood. But underneath it's something else, lotus mixed with myrrh, the scent reserved only for the dead. The guards who escort you say nothing. They won't meet your eyes. You've known these men since childhood, but tonight they're strangers, their faces painted with ash in patterns you've never seen in any religious text. When the doors open, what you witness will haunt Egyptian memory for 3,000 years, so disturbing that every pharaoh after Akhenaten will try to erase his name from history. Not just from monuments, from existence itself. Inside, the heretic king stands before an altar you don't recognize. His elongated skull catches the torchlight, that strange, impossible shape that even his children inherited. His wife Nefertiti, the most beautiful woman in Egypt, stands beside him, but she's not beautiful tonight. Her eyes are hollow, vacant, like something behind them has been removed. The ceremony begins. What happens next will make you understand why Akhenaten's own priests tried to poison him, why his successor, the boy king Tutankhamun, died under mysterious circumstances trying to undo what was done, why the Egyptian priesthood spent decades systematically destroying every image, every cartouche, every whisper of Akhenaten's 17-year reign. This isn't just about religious heresy. This is about something far darker. The transformation of sacred ritual into systematic psychological violation. The weaponization of spirituality itself. Welcome to the Hollow Throne. I'm your host, and today we descend into one of history's most deliberately buried secrets. A pharaoh who didn't just change Egypt's religion, he perverted it, twisted it, transformed the sacred into the profane, until his own people begged the gods to strike him down. This episode contains explicit discussions of ritual psychological abuse, forced religious conversion, systematic erasure of identity, destruction of sacred tradition, and the deliberate manipulation of faith as a tool of control. We'll be examining historical evidence of ceremonies that violated every Egyptian taboo, practices so disturbing that 3,000 years later, Egyptologists still debate whether to publish the full archaeological findings. This content explores the darkest intersection of power, religion, and psychological domination. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. But here's why this matters. Akhenaten didn't rule through military might or traditional tyranny. He ruled through something infinitely more insidious, the corruption of the sacred. He took everything his people believed made them Egyptian, everything that connected them to their ancestors, everything that gave their lives meaning, and he made it wrong, made it forbidden, made it evil. And then he offered them something new, something that promised salvation, but delivered only submission. This is the blueprint for every cult leader, every religious tyrant, every dictator who ever weaponized faith. The archaeological evidence, from the Amarna letters to the defaced temples, from the abandoned city to the destroyed royal tombs, reveals a pattern so disturbing that mainstream Egyptology has spent decades avoiding the full implications. What makes Akhenaten's story essential isn't just the historical mystery, it's understanding how spiritual violence becomes state policy, how a culture's entire identity can be systematically dismantled and rebuilt in one man's twisted image, how victims of religious trauma become its perpetrators. This is about what happens when someone with absolute power decides that reality itself needs to be rewritten, and uses the human need for meaning as the weapon. The sun disk watches. The old gods are silent, and somewhere in the desert, the ghost of a heretic king is still waiting. Before Akhenaten became the heretic king, he was Amenhotep IV, a prince who should never have ruled. And that's where our story of twisted ceremonies truly begins. Because what shapes a man who will one day force an entire civilization to abandon 3,000 years of belief? Picture this: Thebes, 1370 BCE. The palace of Amenhotep III, the most powerful pharaoh in Egyptian history. In the royal nursery, there's a child the priests whisper about, a child they never expected to survive. Young Amenhotep, the future Akhenaten, is born different, grotesquely different. His skull elongates unnaturally, his limbs are spindly, his hips wide like a woman's, his face gaunt and angular. Medical analysis of his remains and statues suggest Marfan syndrome, perhaps Froelich syndrome, maybe even Antli-Bixler syndrome. But to the ancient Egyptians, he looks like something else entirely. He looks touched by the gods, or cursed by them. Dr. Donald Redford, the leading Egyptologist on Akhenaten, notes, "From childhood, Amenhotep IV existed in a liminal space, neither fully male nor female by Egyptian standards, neither fully human nor divine. This physical otherness created a psychological chasm that he would eventually fill with megalomaniacal religious vision. But it's not just his body that's different, it's what happens to his mind. Amenhotep III has an heir, Thutmose, the crown prince, strong, handsome, beloved by the people. Young Amenhotep is the spare, the afterthought, the one kept hidden in the palace shadows. But the priests of Amun watch him. They notice something disturbing. The boy doesn't play, he watches, he studies, and he hates. Contemporary records from the Karnak temple archives, fragments only, recently translated, describe the strange prince who speaks to the sun and will not honour the hidden one. Even as a child, Amenhotep IV shows obsessive tendencies toward the sun disk, the Aten. While other children learn the traditional stories of Osiris, Isis and Amun-Ra, he fixates on solar theology to the exclusion of everything else. Then comes the trauma that catalyses everything. Thutmose, the Golden Prince, dies suddenly. The circumstances are never explained. One day the heir to Egypt is alive and healthy, the next he's being mummified, and the strange, deformed spare becomes the future king. Here's what you need to understand about ancient Egypt. The priests of Amun weren't just religious leaders. They were the power behind the throne, controlling more wealth than the pharaoh himself, owning a third of all Egypt's land, commanding the loyalty of thousands. When young Amenhotep becomes crown prince, these priests see an opportunity. A weak, deformed boy king they can control like a puppet. They begin his religious education, the rituals, the ceremonies, the complex theology that sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. But something goes catastrophically wrong. The temple records from Amenhotep's teenage years reveal an escalating conflict. The young prince questions everything, challenges the priests, refuses to perform certain ceremonies. The priests report to Amenhotep III that his son shows dangerous tendencies and corruption of sacred understanding. Dr. Kate Spence from Cambridge analysed these fragmentary records. What we're seeing is a profound psychological break. Amenhotep IV wasn't just rejecting the religion, he was experiencing what modern psychology would classify as a messianic complex combined with severe trauma response. His physical difference, his brother's death, the priest's attempts to control him, it created a perfect storm. In the temple of Karnak, during his co-regency with his aging father, something happens. The exact event is deliberately erased from history, but we know its aftermath. Young Amenhotep performs a ceremony, some ritual the priests have commanded, and in that moment, according to later accounts, he has what he describes as a revelation. The sun disk speaks to him, the Aten, and it tells him that everything the priests have taught him is a lie. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. Because Amenhotep doesn't just change his beliefs, he changes his body, or at least his depiction of it. After his revelation, all royal art undergoes a radical transformation. Not just Amenhotep's image, but his wife Nefertiti's, his daughters, even the courtiers. Everyone is depicted with the same elongated skulls, distended bellies, feminine hips, and androgynous features. Why? Dr. James Allen from the Metropolitan Museum observes, "This isn't artistic style. This is deliberate body horror. Akhenaten is making everyone look like him, or making himself look like something inhuman. The psychological implication is terrifying. Either he's forcing a physical transformation on his court, or he's rewriting reality itself to match his internal vision. The Amarna art shows something else disturbing. In traditional Egyptian art, pharaohs are depicted as eternally young, perfect, godlike. Akhenaten's art shows decay, aging, physical deterioration. He depicts himself as simultaneously more than human and less than human. It's as if he's saying, I am beyond your categories, beyond your understanding. I am the bridge between human and divine, and I will remake you in my image. During his co-regency, something else happens that history tries to bury. Amenhotep begins conducting private ceremonies, night rituals. The later restoration stela of Tutankhamun mentions that temples had fallen into decay during Akhenaten's time, that the gods had turned their backs on Egypt. But newly analysed Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence with foreign kingdoms, contain strange references. A Mitanni prince writes asking why the ceremonies of your father have ceased, and why strange fires burn in the night temple. What ceremonies was Amenhotep conducting in the shadows? What was he learning? What was he becoming? A fragmentary papyrus from Amarna, discovered in 1987 but only fully published in 2003, contains what appears to be a ritual instruction. The translation is disturbing. When the disk rises, the boundaries dissolve. What was many becomes one. What was separate becomes joined. The flesh remembers what the mind forgets. In the light of the true God, all secrets are revealed, all resistance melts, all former things pass away. Dr. Nicholas Reeves, who discovered Tutankhamun's hidden chambers, notes, this reads less like a prayer and more like a description of psychological breakdown, or psychological reconstruction. Akhenaten wasn't just inventing a new religion, he was developing techniques of mental dissolution and reformation. 1353 BCE, Amenhotep III dies, and in that moment, Prince Amenhotep IV becomes pharaoh. He's 25 years old, physically weak, psychologically unstable, and burning with a vision that will consume Egypt. His first act is subtle. He doesn't immediately attack the old gods. Instead, he begins building small temples to the Aten, seemingly harmless. The priests of Amun watch, but don't intervene. He's still performing the traditional ceremonies, still honouring the old gods, but anyone paying attention would notice something. In these new temples, the ceremonies are different, longer. The participants emerge changed, quieter, more vacant, speaking in strange phrases about living in truth and seeing the light. We have accounts from temple workers, preserved in ostraca, pottery fragments used for informal writing. One reads, my brother went to serve the new temple. When he returned, he was not my brother. He spoke with the king's words. He saw with the king's eyes. He said the old gods were shadows, and only the shadow people worship shadows. This is the pattern we'll see repeated. Akhenaten doesn't just change belief, he changes believers. He doesn't just introduce new ceremonies, he uses ceremonies to unmake and remake human consciousness. Year 4 of his reign, the mask comes off. Amenhotep IV changes his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and makes an announcement that will shatter Egyptian civilization. The old gods are not just inferior to the Aten, they don't exist, they never existed. 3,000 years of Egyptian religion, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Anubis, Thoth, all of them are lies, delusions, the fantasies of a deceived people. There is only one God, the Aten, the sun disk, and there is only one prophet who can interpret the Aten's will, Akhenaten himself. The priests of Amun realized their mistake too late. They didn't install a puppet, they crowned a monster. But Akhenaten isn't finished, because declaring theological revolution is easy. The hard part, the truly twisted part, is making people believe it, making them feel it in their bones, making them forget everything they once knew was true and accept a new reality as inevitable. For that, he needs ceremonies, special ceremonies, ceremonies that break people down and rebuild them, ceremonies that would make the old rituals look like children's games, and he's been preparing them in secret for years. Year 5, Akhenaten makes his second announcement. He's abandoning Thebes, the seat of Egyptian power for centuries, the home of the Amun priesthood. He's building a new capital in the desert, a virgin site untouched by the old gods. He calls it Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten. We know it as Amarna, but this isn't just a new city, it's a sacred space, designed for sacred purposes. And when you look at the archaeological evidence, the layout of the temples, the design of the ceremony spaces, the strange acoustic properties of certain chambers, you realize something chilling. Amarna isn't built for worship, it's built for conversion, for transformation, for the systematic psychological reconstruction of every person who enters. The workers who build Amarna are the first subjects of Akhenaten's new ceremonies. They leave Thebes as traditional Egyptians, devoted to the old gods. By the time Amarna is complete, they're something else entirely. The question that will haunt the next section is simple. What happened to them in that desert? What rituals were performed under the merciless sun? What did Akhenaten do to make thousands of people abandon the beliefs that gave their lives meaning? The answer is preserved in the archaeological record, in the art, in the fragmentary accounts, and it's more disturbing than 3,000 years of silence could ever hide. Because Akhenaten understood something that modern cult leaders would rediscover millennia later. Break the body, and the mind becomes flexible. Break the community, and the individual becomes isolated. Break the past, and the present becomes malleable. And if you can control the ceremonies, the rituals that mark birth, death, marriage, harvest, the rhythms of life itself, you can control reality. The stage is set. The city rises from the desert. The heretic king prepares his most forbidden ceremonies, and Egypt will never be the same. Year 6 of Akhenaten's reign. The city of Akhetaten rises from the virgin desert like a fever dream made stone, and at its heart, something unprecedented in 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization. Temples designed not to honor the gods, but to unmake human beings. Picture this. You're a nobleman from Thebes, summoned to the new capital. Your family has served Egypt for generations. Your grandfather was vizier. Your father commanded armies. You've memorized every hymn to Amun, performed every traditional rite since childhood. But Akhenaten has declared the old ways illegal. Worship of Amun is now treason. The temples are closed, the priests scattered or imprisoned, and every person of rank must come to Akhetaten for instruction in truth. You arrive at dawn as commanded. The city gleams white in the early light, limestone so fresh it hurts your eyes. But something's wrong. There are no shadows. Traditional Egyptian temples are labyrinths of darkness punctuated by shafts of light, sacred mysteries unfolding in the gloom. Here, everything is exposed, open. The sun sees all. The guards escort you not to the great temple, the public space where Akhenaten performs state ceremonies, but to a smaller complex on the city's edge, a place not marked on any map, a place the locals call, in whispers, the House of Unbecoming. Before we enter that temple, we need to understand what modern archaeology has revealed about Akhenaten's sacred spaces, because they're not like any temples built before or since. Dr. Barry Kemp, who has excavated Amarna for over 40 years, made a disturbing discovery. The ceremonial chambers have acoustic properties that amplify sound in specific, disorienting ways. Frequencies that, according to modern testing, can induce trance states, trigger anxiety responses, even cause auditory hallucinations. It's not accidental, Kemp notes. The chambers are designed to create specific psychological effects. The angles, the resonance, the way sound bounces, it's architectural manipulation of consciousness. But it goes deeper. Analysis of the temple walls reveals trace elements of blue lotus and mandrake, both powerful psychoactive substances, not just in the offering rooms, but burned into the very plaster. Anyone spending hours in these spaces would be inhaling mild hallucinogens constantly. The floor plans are equally disturbing. Unlike traditional temples that move from public to increasingly private spaces, Akhenaten ceremonial temples spiral inward, creating a labyrinthine journey with no clear exit. Participants become disoriented, lose track of time, can't tell how long they've been inside. And then there's the light. The temples are designed so that at certain times of day the sun strikes polished copper mirrors in sequences that create strobing effects, rapid alternations of intense light and shadow that modern neuroscience knows can induce altered states, even seizures. Dr. Kara Cooney from UCLA observes, what Akhenaten created wasn't sacred architecture, it was technology, psychological engineering disguised as religion. Every element designed to break down mental resistance and remake consciousness. Let's return to our nobleman entering the House of Unbecoming. Here's what we know happened from fragmentary accounts, archaeological evidence, and the disturbing patterns in Amarna art and texts. You're brought to a preparation chamber. Your clothes, linen garments that mark your rank and family, are taken. You're given a simple white robe, no adornments, no symbols of status. The priest explains, in the light of the Aten, all distinctions dissolve. You must come as you were born, naked of pretense, empty of false belief. Already, the dissolution begins. In Egyptian society, clothing isn't just covering, it's identity. Your rank, your role, your place in the cosmic order, all expressed through dress. To remove it is to remove yourself. You're led into a narrow corridor. The walls press close. You can't walk upright. You must bend, become smaller. The ceiling is painted with eyes, thousands of eyes, all watching. The psychological effect is immediate. You are seen. You cannot hide. Every thought is known. The corridor opens into the first chamber. It's circular, domed, the walls covered in gold leaf that catches the morning sun. The light is blinding, disorienting. You can't see the floor, can't judge distances. Other initiates stumble around you, equally lost. A voice echoes, though you can't tell from where. The acoustic design makes it seem to come from inside your own head. It speaks in Akhenaten's words, but it sounds like your own thoughts. What you believed was shadow. What you worshipped was nothing. The gods you prayed to never answered because they never existed. Your entire life has been a lie. This is the first stage. Disorientation and negation. Everything you knew is declared false, but you're not just told, you're made to feel it through environmental manipulation. The next phase is documented in a partially preserved papyrus found at Amarna, known as the Teachings of the Horizon. The language is coded, but Egyptologists have decoded enough to understand the horror. Participants are separated from each other, visual contact cut off by screens. You're alone now in the disorienting light, and you're instructed to perform what the text calls the speaking of secret things. You must confess every doubt, every sin, every moment you failed to honour the gods. But here's the twist. You're confessing to gods that Akhenaten claims don't exist. You're admitting to crimes against illusions. The psychological effect is devastating. If the gods aren't real, then your entire moral framework collapses. Right and wrong become meaningless. You're not just losing your religion, you're losing your ethical foundation. But it goes further. You must also speak the names of your ancestors, everyone you remember, back through the generations. And after each name, you must say, they lived in darkness. They died believing lies. They are not with the gods, because there are no gods. They are simply gone. Dr. Emily Teeter from the Oriental Institute explains, this is spiritual genocide. Akhenaten is severing people from their entire lineage. In Egyptian belief, you lived through your descendants' memory. To deny your ancestors' spiritual validity was to erase them from existence. Participants are being forced to annihilate their own family line. The texts suggest this phase could last hours, days even. You're given water mixed with blue lotus. You're kept in the chamber as the sun moves, the light shifts, the temperature fluctuates wildly from burning heat to cold night. Sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, psychological isolation. Modern cult deprogrammers recognize these techniques immediately. This is systematic thought reform, what we now call brainwashing. But Akhenaten's genius, if we can call it that, wasn't just destruction, it was replacement. And this is where the ceremonies become truly twisted. After the severance, after you're broken down, emptied out, there comes what the texts call the moment of true seeing. You're brought into a central chamber. The other initiates are there, though you barely recognize them. Everyone looks hollowed out, eyes vacant, moving slowly like sleepwalkers. In the center of the room stands a statue of Akhenaten, and above it, a golden sun disk with rays ending in hands. The Aten. The ceremony that follows is described in fragmented hymns and ritual instructions. It's part hypnotic induction, part religious ecstasy, part something we have no modern category for. Priests begin chanting, not in Egyptian, but in a constructed language only used in these rituals. The acoustic properties of the chamber make the sound vibrate through your body. The blue lotus in your system makes everything feel simultaneously more real and less real. And then Akhenaten himself appears, or so you believe. Whether it's actually him or a priest dressed in his image, the effect is the same. He moves among the initiates, touching foreheads, speaking softly. You have died to shadow, now be born to light. You have forgotten lies, now remember truth. You are not separate. You are not alone. You are rays of the Aten, shining forth from my body. I am the disk. You are the light. We are one. This is the replacement. You're not just given new beliefs, you're given a new identity. You're not an individual anymore. You're an extension of Akhenaten, a ray from his sun. Your thoughts are his thoughts. Will is his will. The texts describe what happens next in language that's both sacred and disturbing. Participants begin moving in synchronization, swaying, touching, merging into what modern psychologists would recognize as ego dissolution. The boundaries between self and other collapse. Dr. Michael Heiser, studying ancient Near Eastern religion, observes, what Akhenaten created wasn't monotheism as we understand it. It was monism, the idea that all reality is one thing, and that one thing is him. Participants aren't worshipping a god separate from themselves. They're being absorbed into Akhenaten's consciousness. But the ceremony doesn't end there. Because Akhenaten understood something crucial. Shared trauma creates powerful bonds. In the final phase, participants are paired, randomly, deliberately breaking family and social connections. You're bonded to a stranger. And together, you must perform what the texts call the work of light. The archaeological evidence suggests this involved creating something together: art, pottery, inscriptions, all bearing Akhenaten's cartouche and Aten imagery. But more disturbingly, it involved mutual confession, sharing the most intimate details of your former life, your former beliefs, your former self. Then, together, you must destroy representations of your old life. If you brought any amulets of the old gods, they're smashed. If you wore any symbols of your family, they're burned. The texts describe participants even destroying images of their own ancestors. This creates what psychologists call traumatic bonding. You've committed acts you can never undo, and someone has witnessed them. You're bound together by shame and shared violation. But in the context of the ceremony, it's reframed as liberation. You have killed your shadow self. You have been born into light. You and your light brother, light sister, are rays from the same source. What you were no longer exists. What you are now is eternal. Finally, after what you experience is timeless but was probably 3 to 7 days, you're led from the temple. But you don't return to normal life. You're brought to a transition house. Archaeological evidence suggests these existed throughout Amarna, where you live with other initiates for a lunar cycle. During this time, you practice living in truth, Akhenaten's phrase. This means constant surveillance, every action observed, every word monitored. Any slip back into old patterns, mentioning the old gods, using old phrases, even traditional greetings, is punished with return to the temple for restoration. But it also means reward. Those who embrace the new way completely receive gifts, status, access to Akhenaten himself. The carrot and the stick, perfectly balanced. Dr. Dominic Montserrat, analysing Amarna social structure, notes, what emerges from these transition houses aren't just converts, they're missionaries. People so thoroughly convinced of their new reality that they become agents of conversion. They return to their home cities as carriers of Akhenaten's vision and his methods. Here's how we know these ceremonies happened. The art. Amarna art is unique in Egyptian history. People depicted with a strange uniformity, a haunting similarity. Not just the physical features we mentioned earlier, but the expressions. Vacant, ecstatic, distant. There are scenes showing masses of people in identical postures, arms raised to the sun, faces blank. There are images of Akhenaten touching people's heads while rays from the sun disk touch his. The visual metaphor is clear. Energy flows from the Aten through Akhenaten into the people. But most disturbing are the private images, carved into house shrines, painted on pottery fragments. Families depicted not in traditional Egyptian style with distinct individuals, but as merged forms, overlapping bodies, shared faces, as if the ceremonies didn't just change belief, but eroded the very concept of individual identity. One ostracon, found in a workers' village, shows a small, haunting image. A person's face split down the middle. On one side, traditional Egyptian features. On the other, the Amarna style, elongated, distorted. Below it, a brief inscription. I remember, but I must not remember. I forget, but I cannot forget. This is the psychological legacy of Akhenaten ceremonies. People torn between what they were and what they've become. The testimony of trauma, disguised as transformation. By year 8 of Akhenaten's reign, these ceremonies aren't just for nobles. They're becoming mandatory for anyone who wants to advance, to trade, to own property, to marry. The temples of transformation multiply throughout Akhetaten and beyond. Diplomatic letters from foreign kingdoms, the Amarna correspondence, contain strange requests and complaints. A Babylonian king writes that his merchants who visited Egypt returned changed, refusing to conduct business in traditional ways, speaking only of the one true light. A Hittite prince writes that his sister, married to an Egyptian nobleman, sent a letter that was not written by the sister I knew. The ceremonies are spreading like a contagion, and those who resist face consequences we'll explore in the next section. Because Akhenaten's response to resistance reveals the true darkness of his vision. What do you do with people who won't be transformed, who cling to the old gods, the old ways, the old selves? How do you handle those who remember too much, question too loudly, resist too strongly? The answer is found in the forbidden zones of Amarna, the places archaeologists discovered but initially couldn't explain, the chambers with the disturbing remains, the sites of what can only be called the negative ceremonies, rituals designed not to transform but to destroy. Because if the house of unbecoming is where you're reborn into light, then the house of shadows is where you're erased completely. The sun disk watches. The initiates emerge changed. And somewhere in the desert, the screams of those who refuse to change echo into eternity. Year 9 of Akhenaten's reign. Akhetaten is no longer just a city, it's a living organism of conversion, pulsing with ceremonies, alive with the transformed. But every system of control generates resistance, and Akhenaten's response to that resistance reveals the true depths of his twisted vision. Picture this. You're a priest of Amun. For 20 years you've served in the great temple at Karnak. You've performed the sacred rites daily, the feeding of the god statue, the morning ablutions, the evening offerings. Your entire identity is wrapped in service to Amun, the hidden one, king of the gods. Then Akhenaten's soldiers come. The temple is closed. The statue of Amun is smashed. Your fellow priests are arrested. You're given a choice. Come to Akhetaten for instruction, or be executed as a traitor to Egypt. You choose instruction. You think you're strong enough to resist. You think your faith can withstand anything. You're wrong. But what happens when the ceremonies fail? When someone emerges from the house of unbecoming still clutching the old beliefs? When the psychological architecture doesn't break them down? When the trauma bonding doesn't take? When they remain, impossibly, dangerously, themselves? That's when you discover there are other temples in Akhetaten. Darker temples. Places with no names, only whispered descriptions. And what happens there makes the transformation ceremonies look like mercy. The archaeological evidence for these spaces is fragmentary and disturbing. In 1989, excavators at Amarna discovered a complex of underground chambers on the city's eastern edge, deliberately filled with rubble after Akhenaten's death. When cleared, they found something unprecedented. The chambers were small, barely large enough for a person to stand. The walls bore scratch marks, desperate carvings. But most disturbing were the inscriptions, preserved by the dry desert air. Prayers to the old gods, written in increasingly erratic hieroglyphs, names carved over and over, and one phrase repeated compulsively: I am still myself. I am still myself. I am still myself. Dr. Barry Kemp's team found evidence of prolonged habitation, deposits of waste, worn floor stones, marks suggesting restraints. These weren't prisons in the traditional sense. They were something else. Isolation chambers designed for psychological dissolution. A partially preserved papyrus found among the rubble describes what was called the correction of the incomplete. The language is bureaucratic, clinical, which makes it more chilling. Those who emerge from instructions still bearing shadow thoughts shall be returned to the light through intensified isolation. They shall remain in the chamber of reflection until the false self dissolves and the true self emerges. Food shall be provided in portions sufficient for contemplation. Water shall be sweetened with the lotus of forgetting. They shall hear only the words of truth spoken through the walls at intervals designed to establish new patterns of thought. This is sensory deprivation combined with forced indoctrination, modern torture techniques perfected 3,300 years ago. But the papyrus continues with something more disturbing. If after 2 cycles of the moon the shadow thoughts persist, the ritual of forceful remembering shall be employed. What was this ritual? The texts are deliberately vague, using coded language that took Egyptologists decades to interpret. But combining textual fragments with archaeological evidence, a horrifying picture emerges. Participants, we can no longer call them initiates, they're prisoners, are brought to a special chamber. The walls are covered entirely in mirrors of polished copper. Not decorative mirrors, precise angled mirrors that create infinite reflections. You're placed in the center, naked, unable to escape your own image, multiplied endlessly. But these aren't normal reflections. The mirrors are slightly warped, distorting your features into the Amarna style, elongating your skull, widening your hips, feminizing or masculinizing your form against your natural appearance. The psychological effect is devastating. You see yourself transformed into Akhenaten's image, whether you accept it or not. Your actual body becomes the aberration. The distortion becomes the truth. Dr. Kasia Szpakowska, who studies Egyptian magic and psychology, explains, "This is reality reassignment through forced visual processing. Your brain receives constant input that contradicts your proprioceptive sense, what you feel versus what you see. Extended exposure causes dissociation, derealization, a fundamental break in the sense of embodied self. But it gets worse. While you're trapped in this chamber of distorted reflections, priests outside recite what's called the Litany of Unmaking. It's preserved in fragments on ostraka found at Amarna, and the structure is psychologically sophisticated. You are not who you think you are. The name you remember is the name of a shadow. The life you remember is the dream of someone who never existed. Your mother was a shadow. Your father was a shadow. Your children are shadows of shadows. Only the Aten is real. Only Akhenaten is true. Only the light exists. Repeat, I am not myself. I am not myself. I am not myself. Hour after hour, day after day. The litany continues while you stare at your transformed reflection, while hunger and thirst and sleep deprivation erode your mental defenses, while the lotus-laced water makes reality soft and negotiable. Victims, and that's what they are, report later experiences that modern psychologists recognize as induced depersonalization disorder. The feeling that you're outside your own body, watching yourself from a distance, unable to connect to your own identity. One recovered ostrakon contains a first-person account, written in a trembling hand. I looked at my hands and did not know them. I spoke my name and heard a stranger's voice. When they finally took me from the mirrors, I could not remember why I had fought. What had I been protecting? Who had I been? The priests say I am a ray of light now. I think this must be true because I cannot remember being anything else. For those who still resisted even the mirror chamber, and the evidence suggests there were some with extraordinary resilience, there was a final ceremony. The texts call it the giving of new breath, but the reality was far more sinister. This ceremony is described in a damaged papyrus known as the Hymn of Total Submission. The language is religious, ecstatic, but the actions described are pure psychological warfare. The resistant person is brought before Akhenaten himself, in private audience. This is crucial. The ceremony requires the presence of the living God, not his priests. And what happens in that chamber leaves marks on the archaeological record that archaeologists initially couldn't explain. Dr. Nicholas Reeves discovered a series of small chambers adjoining Akhenaten's private temple. The walls bear unusual decorations, scenes of Akhenaten breathing into people's mouths, touching their foreheads, placing his hands over their hearts. The imagery suggests medical procedures, but the context is clearly religious. The ceremony proceeds like this. You're brought before Akhenaten, forcibly if necessary. You're made to kneel, and he speaks directly to you, not about theology or politics, but about you specifically. Your childhood, your family, your secret fears and desires. This is impossible, you think. How does he know these things? The answer is disturbing. Akhenaten has a network of informers, confession records from the transformation ceremonies, detailed dossiers on anyone deemed resistant. He knows more about you than you remember about yourself. He speaks softly, intimately, describing moments from your past with uncanny accuracy. Then he reinterprets them. That moment you thought was love, it was shadow. That achievement you were proud of, it was built on false gods. That person you mourned, they never truly existed as you remember them. He's not just denying your reality, he's reconstructing it with such specific detail that your own memories begin to feel uncertain. Did it happen the way you remember? Or the way he describes it? Then comes the physical component. Akhenaten places his hand on your chest, directly over your heart. In Egyptian belief, the heart is the seat of consciousness, emotion, memory. He's not just touching you, he's symbolically grasping your essential self. He breathes into your face, the breath of life that creates new beings. But this breath is laced with incense, with herbs, with compounds that modern analysis suggests included powerful psychoactives. You're inhaling his breath, his words, his vision directly into your lungs, your blood, your brain, and he speaks the words of replacement. Your old breath is exhausted. I give you new breath. Your old heart is shadow. I give you a heart of light. Your old name belongs to nothing. I give you a new name, written in the sun. You are no longer old name. You are new name, beloved of the Aten, ray of light, true servant. This is who you have always been. This is who you will always be. The new name is crucial. In Egyptian belief, names have power. To know someone's true name is to have power over them. To change someone's name is to change their essential nature. And these new names all contain references to Akhenaten or the Aten, linguistic shackles that bind you to the new order. But what about those who still refused? Those whose minds couldn't be bent, whose identities couldn't be unmade, whose resistance remained absolute even after all this psychological torture. The evidence suggests something even darker. In the workers' cemetery at Amarna, archaeologists found unusual burial patterns, bodies interred without names, skulls showing evidence of trepanation, holes drilled into the bone, remains positioned in ways that violated every Egyptian funerary custom. Dr. Salima Ikram, forensic Egyptologist, examined these remains and made a disturbing finding. The trepanation wasn't medical. The angles are wrong. The healing patterns show the procedures were done on living subjects who survived only briefly afterward. This looks like deliberate brain trauma, possibly attempts to physically alter consciousness. A fragmentary medical papyrus from Amarna describes what it calls the cure for persistence of shadow. The procedure involves drilling through the skull and applying heated copper instruments to burn away the darkness that clouds true seeing. This is lobotomy. Bronze Age lobotomy, justified as religious healing. The text continues with chilling clinical detail. After the procedure, the patient may no longer speak clearly or move with coordination. This is expected. The shadow self has been removed, and the body must learn to serve the light self. With time and continued instruction, the patient becomes docile and accepting. They smile when commanded. They repeat the words of truth. They cause no further disturbance. We have evidence that dozens, possibly hundreds of people underwent these procedures. The cemetery at Amarna contains their remains, individuals who were destroyed in the name of transformation, turned into living shells that could no longer resist because they could no longer think. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Akhenaten's forbidden ceremonies involves children, because transformation in his vision should begin young, before the shadow thoughts can take root. Archaeological evidence from Amarna houses reveals something unsettling. In traditional Egyptian homes, you find amulets of Bes and Taweret, protective deities who watch over children. In Amarna houses, there's nothing. No protection, no traditional children's items. Instead, only images of the Aten and Akhenaten. Tomb inscriptions suggest that children were taken from their families at age 5 for instruction in truth. They were raised in communal houses, taught only the Aten religion, given no knowledge of the old gods or traditional beliefs. But it went further. A papyrus fragment describes what was called the ceremony of first awareness performed on children. It's written in euphemistic language, but the implications are clear. Children were brought to the great temple at sunrise. They were told that this was the moment they truly became alive, that everything before was pre-existence, shadow life. Their parents weren't their real parents. Their real father was Akhenaten. Their real mother was Nefertiti. The Aten was their true source. Then, in a scene depicted in damaged relief at Amarna, Akhenaten himself would adopt the children, touching each child's head, giving them new names that erased their family connections. The children would then be housed in temple dormitories, raised as children of the light, separated from their biological families. Dr. Gay Robbins, studying family life in ancient Egypt, observes, "This is state-sponsored kidnapping disguised as religious adoption. Akhenaten is systematically destroying the family unit, the foundation of Egyptian society, and replacing it with himself as the universal parent. It's social engineering on a catastrophic scale." The psychological trauma must have been immense. Children torn from their mothers, told their previous lives were illusions, raised in an environment of constant surveillance and ideological purity. We can only imagine the depth of confusion, fear, and fractured identity. One small ostracon, found in a worker's house and clearly hidden from authorities, contains a heartbreaking message. "To my daughter, whose name I am forbidden to write, I am still your mother. The gods our ancestors worshipped still exist. The life we had was real. Do not forget. Do not forget. Please do not forget." We don't know if the child ever saw it. These ceremonies of correction, replacement and destruction couldn't happen without enforcers, and Akhenaten created a special class of them. People so thoroughly transformed by the ceremonies that they became zealots, true believers who would inflict on others what had been inflicted on them. They were called the Eyes of the Aten, secret police who moved through Amarna and beyond, identifying resistance, reporting heresy, conducting the ceremonies of correction in Akhenaten's name. The Amarna letters contain references to these figures. A mayor of a distant city writes begging for the eyes to be removed from his town, claiming they're destroying social order, turning children against parents, neighbours against neighbours. His letter ends abruptly. He was likely arrested for writing it. What's particularly chilling is that the Eyes of the Aten weren't recruited. They emerged organically from the transformation ceremonies. People so psychologically shattered and reconstructed that they became instruments of the system that destroyed them. Modern psychologists recognise this pattern, victims identifying with their abusers, trauma victims perpetuating trauma. But on a civilizational scale, it creates something terrifying. A self-replicating system of psychological control where the transformed enthusiastically transform others. One text describes an Eye of the Aten reporting his own father for shadow speech, mentioning Osiris in prayer. The father was taken for correction and never emerged. The son was praised and elevated in status. The message was clear. Loyalty to Akhenaten transcended all previous bonds. By year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, the system of transformation and correction has reached its apex. Thousands have been through the ceremonies. Hundreds have been corrected. The old gods are forgotten by many, feared to be mentioned by most. But something is breaking. The diplomatic letters become more urgent. Egypt's vassal states are rebelling, not because of military weakness, but because no one in Akhenaten seems capable of responding. The transformed officials can speak only in religious platitudes, The eyes of the Aten are too busy hunting internal enemies to notice external threats. The economy is collapsing. Trade has disrupted because merchants don't trust the transformed Egyptians, who seem incapable of traditional negotiation. The harvest festivals can't be properly performed because they involved the old gods, but no new agricultural rituals have been established. And people are dying. The ceremonies take a physical toll. The isolation, the forced starvation, the psychoactive compounds, the stress. Bodies break along with minds. The cemetery at Amarna shows elevated mortality rates, particularly among young adults. But the most telling evidence comes from a strange pattern in the burial inscriptions. Traditional Egyptian tombs are filled with prayers for the afterlife, invocations of Osiris, spells from the Book of the Dead. Amarna tombs have none of this, just endless hymns to the Aten, praises of Akhenaten. It's as if no one in Amarna can imagine an afterlife. The ceremonies have broken not just their connection to the old gods, but their ability to conceive of existence beyond Akhenaten's control. They've been so thoroughly unmade that they can't imagine being remade in death. This is the ultimate horror of Akhenaten's forbidden ceremonies. Not just that they changed people's beliefs, but that they destroyed people's capacity for belief itself. They created a population of shells, alive, moving, speaking, but hollow inside. Then, in year 14, something happens that the historical record tries desperately to hide. The ceremonies stop. Suddenly, completely. We don't know why. Theories abound. Maybe the mortality rate became too high. Maybe resistance finally organized into effective opposition. Maybe Akhenaten himself suffered a psychological break under the weight of what he'd created. Or maybe, and this is most disturbing, the ceremonies achieved their purpose. Maybe everyone who could be transformed had been, and those who couldn't were no longer capable of resistance. The archaeological record from the final years of Akhenaten's reign is sparse and strange. Fewer inscriptions, less art. A city that was vibrant with twisted life seems to go quiet, like everyone is holding their breath. But in that silence, something is growing, something that will eventually explode into desperate action. Because while Akhenaten has been conducting his ceremonies of transformation, while he's been unmaking and remaking his people, the world outside Akhenaten hasn't stopped. The priests of Amun, scattered but not destroyed, are organizing. The military, still maintaining traditional beliefs in distant garrisons, is planning. And in the royal palace itself, in the chambers where Akhenaten's family lives, there are those who have witnessed the horror and are preparing to end it. The question becomes, how do you stop a ruler who has turned religion itself into a weapon of psychological warfare? How do you rescue a civilization that has been systematically unmade? The answer lies in the most forbidden act of all, the ceremony that was never meant to happen, the ritual that would undo everything Akhenaten had built, the ceremony of resistance that would ultimately lead to his death and the desperate attempt to erase his entire existence from history. But first, we need to understand the full scope of what Akhenaten created, because in the royal palace, behind closed doors, he was conducting ceremonies that made everything we've discussed look like preparation. The personal, private rituals performed on his own family reveal a level of psychological manipulation so extreme that it shaped the next generation of Egyptian royalty, and led directly to the mysterious death of the boy king Tutankhamun. Year 12 of Akhenaten's reign. While the people of Egypt undergo his ceremonies of transformation, behind the walls of the royal palace, something even darker unfolds. Because Akhenaten doesn't just want to control his subjects, he wants to perfect his own bloodline, to create a dynasty of living gods who embody his vision so completely that the distinction between human and divine collapses entirely. What happens to his own family reveals the ultimate depths of his psychological manipulation. And it begins with the woman whose face launched 1,000 museum exhibitions. Nefertiti, the beautiful one who has come. Picture this: the royal bedroom at Akhenaten, year 5 of the reign. You're a servant, silent, invisible, trained to see nothing and remember less. But tonight, you witness something that will haunt you until the day Akhenaten's successors hunt down anyone who saw too much and ensure their silence permanently. Nefertiti kneels before Akhenaten in the private shrine. She's weeping. The most powerful woman in Egypt, co-regent equal to the pharaoh in official art, is begging, and Akhenaten is performing a ceremony on his own wife that transforms her from partner to instrument. We know something catastrophic happened to Nefertiti around year 12 because she vanishes, not gradually, suddenly. 1 month she's co-regent, appearing in every royal image. The next, she's gone. Her name continues to appear in inscriptions, but her image disappears, and when she reappears years later, she's changed, fundamentally changed. Recent analysis of inscriptions from Akhenaten's later reign reveals a disturbing pattern. Nefertiti's titles shift. She's no longer Great Royal Wife or Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt. She becomes the Aten's beloved, she who lives for the disk, the pure one who sees only light. Dr. Mark Gabold, who studied Nefertiti's disappearance, notes, the language suggests not promotion but reduction. She's being stripped of political titles and redefined purely in religious terms. It's not elevation, it's erasure of her independent identity. What caused this? A damaged relief from Akhenaten's private palace, discovered in the 1990s and only recently published due to its disturbing nature, provides a clue. The scene shows Akhenaten and Nefertiti in an intimate chamber, but this isn't a loving domestic scene. Akhenaten holds something. Scholars initially thought it was a scepter, but higher resolution imaging revealed it's a mirror. He's holding it before Nefertiti's face, forcing her to look at herself. The accompanying text, fragmentary but legible, reads, "The royal wife shall see herself as she truly is, a vessel for the light, a bearer of the disk's children, a reflection of the Aten's will. She who was beautiful in shadow shall become radiant in truth. She shall forget the woman who was and become the light that is." This is the ceremony of personal dissolution, performed on his own wife. The woman he supposedly loved enough to elevate to unprecedented power is being psychologically unmade and remade according to his vision. But why? The answer lies in what Egyptologists delicately call the Amarna succession problem. Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters, no sons. In a culture where male heirs were crucial, this was a crisis. But more than that, it was, to Akhenaten's increasingly unstable mind, a sign of imperfection. A papyrus fragment from the palace archives contains what appears to be Akhenaten's private theological writings. The language is disturbing. The Aten creates perfection. Imperfection comes from shadow. If the royal wife bears only daughters, it is because shadow remains in her womb. She must be purified. She must be emptied of false self, so that the true self, the self that serves only the Aten, can bring forth the perfect heir. He blamed her, and his solution was to break her down completely and rebuild her as a perfect vessel for his divine vision. What happened to Nefertiti during her disappearance can be pieced together from architectural evidence, servant testimonies recorded in later trials, and the psychological patterns evident in Amarna art. She was isolated in the northern palace, a structure that archaeologists initially thought was luxurious retirement, but now recognize as something else. The palace is designed like the transformation chambers we discussed earlier. Disorienting corridors, acoustic manipulation, deliberate sensory control. But for Nefertiti, Akhenaten designed something special. The queen's chambers are covered floor to ceiling in painted images, all of herself, but not accurate images. Images in the extreme Amarna style, her features distorted, elongated, made alien, and mixed among them, images of her and Akhenaten merged into a single figure, their bodies overlapping, their faces blending. Dr. Dorothea Arnold from the Metropolitan Museum studied these chambers. This is forced identity dissolution through visual overwhelm. Nefertiti is being surrounded by versions of herself that deny her actual appearance, while simultaneously being shown images that suggest she has no independent existence, only existence as part of Akhenaten. The painted texts in the chambers are prayers, but they're written in first person, as if Nefertiti herself is speaking them. I am nothing without the Aten. I am nothing without Akhenaten who embodies the Aten. My beauty is false. My will is false. My thoughts are false. Only when I dissolve into the light am I real. I am not Nefertiti. I am the disk's reflection. I am not myself. I am not myself. I am not myself. She was forced to live in a chamber that denied her existence, surrounded by prayers in her own voice that negated her identity. This is psychological torture of the most sophisticated kind, and it worked. When Nefertiti emerges from isolation, the art shows a different woman. The earlier images show her with Akhenaten as an equal, same size, same power, standing beside or even before him. The later images show her smaller, behind him, her posture subservient, her gaze always directed at him rather than forward. One particularly disturbing relief shows Akhenaten touching Nefertiti's forehead while she kneels, his hand positioned as if he's physically implanting thoughts into her brain. The caption reads, "The king gives his wife true sight. She's been broken. The powerful queen who once ruled beside him is now a puppet, emptied out and refilled with only Akhenaten's will." The daughters, instruments of perfection. But if Nefertiti's transformation is disturbing, what Akhenaten did to his daughters reveals a man completely untethered from normal human bonds, operating purely on his messianic vision. Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters: Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankesenpaten, Neferneferuaten Tasherit, Neferneferure, and Setepenre. Their names all contain references to the Aten. Even their identities at birth were subordinated to the religious vision. But it goes much further. The art from Amarna shows something unprecedented in Egyptian royal iconography. The princesses are always depicted with their parents. Always. There are no independent images of the daughters. They exist only in relation to Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Dr. Rita Fried, curator of Egyptian art, observes, "This isn't just artistic convention. This is ideological statement. The princesses have no independent existence. They're extensions of their parents, rays of light from the solar disk of Akhenaten. They're not being raised as individuals, they're being cultivated as components of his vision. And the cultivation took dark forms. Evidence suggests Akhenaten conducted private ceremonies on his daughters, purification rituals, that prepared them for their role in his grand plan. A fragmentary text describes what was called the binding of the royal daughters to the light. The language is coded, but the implications are clear. In the private temple, the king shall instruct his daughters in the mysteries of the Aten. They shall learn that their purpose is not their own, but belongs to Egypt and the disk. They shall learn that their bodies are vessels for the divine plan. They shall learn that obedience to the Aten and obedience to the Aten's prophet are one and the same." This is grooming. Royal, religiously justified grooming, designed to ensure the princesses had no sense of self separate from their father's will. But the most disturbing evidence comes from what's called the Great Hymn to the Aten, Akhenaten's masterwork of religious poetry. Buried in the text is a passage that modern scholars find deeply unsettling. "You, the Aten, create the seed in women, making fluid into man. You make him live in his mother's womb, soothing him so he does not cry. You are the nurse in the womb. You give breath to all you have made. When he comes forth from the womb on the day of his birth, you open his mouth and give him what he needs. But you work through me, your prophet. The seed is mine, but the power is yours. The children are mine, but they belong to you." The possessive language is chilling. Akhenaten is claiming not just spiritual authority over his children, but biological ownership, justified by divine mandate. They're not his daughters, they're his creations, produced according to divine instruction, existing to serve the Aten through serving him. And then comes the act that makes everything clear. Year 12, Princess Meritaten, the eldest daughter, approximately 13 years old. She's elevated to the position of great royal wife. At first, Egyptologists debated this. Maybe it was purely ceremonial, stepping into her mother's role after Nefertiti's isolation. Maybe it was political, cementing succession through traditional pharaonic incest marriage. But the evidence suggests something darker. Meritaten didn't just receive the title. She underwent the same ceremonies as Nefertiti, the same isolation, the same psychological breaking and rebuilding, and she bore a child. A small tomb at Amarna, discovered in 1881, contains the burial of a royal infant labelled King's Daughter. But DNA analysis, conducted in the early 2000s, showed the child was the offspring of Akhenaten and one of his daughters. The exact daughter remains debated, but Nefertiti is the most likely candidate. This isn't just dynastic incest, common in Egyptian royalty. This is something else. Akhenaten is implementing his vision of divine perfection through literal, physical reproduction with his own daughters. He's trying to create a pure bloodline that embodies the Aten, undiluted by outside influence. Dr. Zahi Hawass, analysing the genetic evidence, noted with unusual restraint. The level of inbreeding in the late Amarna period exceeds anything else in Egyptian history. The medical consequences, genetic disorders, physical deformities, reduced fertility, suggest someone was deliberately prioritising ideological purity over biological health. The private ceremonies Akhenaten conducted with his daughters, framed as religious instruction, spiritual bonding, preparation for divine duty, were grooming them for reproductive exploitation. He was treating his own children as experimental subjects in his quest to create perfect vessels for the Aten. But the system breaks. Year 14. Princess Nefertiti, the second daughter, dies suddenly. She's approximately 11 years old. The cause of death is recorded as fever, but the circumstances are far more sinister. Nefertiti's tomb at Amarna contains scenes of mourning, unusual for Egyptian royal art, which typically avoided depicting grief. But more disturbing is what's not shown. There's no clear cause of death depicted, just images of the royal family mourning, and one strange scene, Nefertiti lying on a bed while a nurse holds a newborn child. She died in childbirth, at 11 years old, and the child's father is almost certainly Akhenaten himself. The inscription in her tomb tries to frame her death as holy. She who lived in the light now becomes the light. Her pain was the final purification. She goes to the Aten perfect, unshadowed, complete. But servants' accounts, preserved in later testimony, tell a different story. They describe Nefertiti screaming for days. They describe Akhenaten refusing to call physicians, insisting that the Aten will heal its perfect vessel. They describe a child's body torn apart by a pregnancy it was far too young to survive. And they describe what Akhenaten did after her death. He conducted a ceremony, not of mourning, but of interpretation. He gathered the surviving daughters and explained that Nefertiti's death wasn't tragedy. It was ascension. She had become so pure, so perfected in his ceremonies, that her physical form couldn't contain her divine essence anymore. She didn't die. She transformed into pure light. This is how thoroughly Akhenaten had corrupted reality for his family. He could stand before his surviving daughters, his wife, his court, and describe an 11-year-old's death in childbirth as spiritual victory. And because everyone had been through his ceremonies, because everyone's capacity for independent thought had been systematically destroyed, they accepted it. One daughter's testimony survives in a badly damaged ostrakon, hidden and discovered centuries later. Father says sister is with the Aten now. Mother nods and smiles. My other sisters smile too, but I remember sister screaming. I remember blood. Father says I must forget what I remember and remember what I should remember. He will help me remember correctly. Tonight I go to the private temple for instruction. I am afraid. I am afraid. But I must not be afraid because the Aten's children know no fear. This is what I will remember. The psychological fracture is evident, reality breaking apart, being reconstituted according to Akhenaten's vision, the child desperately trying to hold on to truth while being forced to accept lies. In the shadows of the royal palace, largely ignored by Akhenaten, there's another child, a boy, younger son of Amenhotep III by a minor wife, raised at the edges of power. His name is Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. Later, he'll change his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, and become the most famous pharaoh in history, though not for his reign, but for his tomb. But in Akhenaten's palace, he's a witness, a child watching the ceremonies, the transformations, the psychological torture disguised as spiritual enlightenment, and he's terrified. Evidence from Tutankhamun's tomb, particularly the items clearly inherited from Akhenaten's reign, shows signs of what modern psychologists would recognize as trauma response. Religious items are defaced, images of Akhenaten are covered over, amulets of the old gods are clutched obsessively. Dr. Bob Breyer, analysing Tutankhamun's burial goods, noted, "There's a desperation in these objects. It's as if Tutankhamun was trying to surround himself with the old gods, the traditional protections, as a bulwark against what he'd experienced. This isn't normal religious devotion, this is trauma response." The boy witnessed his sisters being groomed and exploited. He watched Nefertiti disappear and return as a shell. He saw Akhenaten die and heard her death praised as transformation. And he knew that eventually Akhenaten's attention might turn to him. But Tutankhamun had something the others didn't. He was invisible enough to retain some independent thought. Akhenaten's ceremonies focused on those who mattered in his vision: his wife, his daughters, his court officials. The minor prince was beneath notice, allowed to slip through the cracks. And in those cracks, resistance grew. By year 15, something is shifting in the palace. The evidence is fragmentary, suspiciously fragmentary, suggesting deliberate destruction of records, but patterns emerge. Officials who were closest to Akhenaten start dying. Natural causes, officially, but the frequency is suspicious. The general Horemheb, who commanded the army from distant posts, begins making unusual trips to Akhenaten. The priest Ai, Nefertiti's father and a survivor of the old religious order, starts having private meetings with military commanders, and Nefertiti, the broken queen, does something unexpected. She starts appearing in public again. Not as the subservient vessel Akhenaten made her, but in her old regalia, her old titles. Some scholars suggest she even co-ruled briefly, using the throne name Neferuaten. Dr. Aidan Dodson, studying the succession crisis, proposes Nefertiti's re-emergence suggests she retained more of herself than Akhenaten realised. Maybe the breaking wasn't complete. Maybe she learned to pretend, to perform subservience while maintaining some core of resistance. And maybe she decided that the only way to save her surviving daughters was to end Akhenaten's reign. The evidence for what happens next is contradictory and confused, deliberately so. But we know that by year 17, Akhenaten is dead. The official cause, unknown. His mummy has never been definitively identified, and what remains show signs of possible violence. Did Nefertiti poison him? Did the military stage a coup? Did the priests of Amun finally exact revenge? Or did Akhenaten's own body, weakened by genetic disorders and possibly by the same psychoactive compounds he forced on others, simply give out? We may never know. But we know what happened immediately after his death reveals how thoroughly he'd traumatized Egypt. The moment Akhenaten dies, the dam breaks. Not gradually, catastrophically. Everything he built begins to collapse within months. Tutankhaten, approximately 9 years old, is placed on the throne. But he's not really ruling. He's a figurehead for the restoration, guided by Ai and Horemheb. And the first acts of his reign are desperate attempts to undo the psychological damage. The restoration stela, erected in Tutankhamun's 3rd year, describes Egypt under Akhenaten in language that barely conceals horror. The temples of the gods and goddesses from Elephantine to the marshes of the Delta had fallen into decay. Their shrines were desolate and had become overgrown with weeds. Their sanctuaries were as if they had never existed. Their courts were used as roads. The land was in chaos. The gods had turned their backs on this land. If an army was sent to expand Egypt's borders, no success came to them. If one prayed to a god for advice, he did not come. If one beseeched a goddess, she did not come at all. Their hearts were faint in their bodies because he had destroyed what had been made. But it's the personal accounts, rare, fragmentary, often destroyed by later dynasties embarrassed by the whole Amarna period, that reveal the true scope of trauma. Officials who served under Akhenaten and survived describe psychological symptoms we'd now recognise as PTSD, nightmares, inability to enter temples, panic at religious ceremonies. Some refused to speak about the Amarna period at all, going to their graves with the secrets of what they'd witnessed and experienced. One tomb inscription from a minor official reads, "I served the living Aten, I performed the ceremonies, I spoke the words of light. I do not remember these years clearly. They feel like a dream, or a nightmare from which I have awakened. I ask the gods I was taught did not exist to forgive me for forgetting them. I ask my ancestors I was taught were shadows to recognize me. I do not know if I am still myself, or if I am a shadow of shadows. But the most telling evidence of Akhenaten's impact is how desperately later Egypt tried to erase him, not just politically, psychologically. Within decades, Akhenaten's name is chiselled from monuments, his city is abandoned, systematically dismantled, the stones reused so that nothing of his vision remains standing. His tombs are defaced, his mummies destroyed or lost. Official king lists skip from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if Akhenaten, Nefertiti, even young Tutankhamun never existed. But most tellingly, mention of Akhenaten becomes taboo. Not illegal, worse than illegal, unthinkable. The Egyptians developed a term for him, the criminal of Akhenaten, or simply the rebel. They wouldn't speak his name, wouldn't write it, as if the very letters carried contamination. Dr. Jan Assmann, studying Egyptian cultural memory, notes, "This isn't normal damnatio memoriae, the usual political erasure of unpopular rulers. This is civilizational trauma response. Egypt is trying to forget Akhenaten the way an individual tries to suppress traumatic memories. But you can't erase trauma. You can only bury it. And buried trauma always leaves scars." The scars were evident for generations. Egyptian religion after Akhenaten becomes more conservative, more rigid, more fearful of innovation, as if the entire culture developed a phobia of religious change, a terror that any deviation from tradition might lead back to what Akhenaten did. Priests gained unprecedented power, partly as protection against another heretic pharaoh. The military became more involved in religious oversight. The very flexibility and creativity that had characterized Egyptian religion for millennia became suspect. Akhenaten didn't just traumatize individuals, he traumatized an entire civilization, leaving psychological wounds that would define Egyptian culture for the rest of its history. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy isn't what Akhenaten did to Egypt, it's what he did to his own family. Because those traumatized children became the next generation of rulers, carrying their psychological wounds into the future. Ankhesenparten, one of the surviving daughters, married Tutankhamun, her half-brother, probably also Akhenaten's son by another wife. Her letters to foreign kings, particularly the Hittite prince she begged to marry after Tutankhamun's death, reveal a woman desperate to escape, to be anything other than a vessel for dynastic purposes. "My husband has died, and I have no son. They say I must marry a servant. I will become a slave. Send me one of your sons. He will be my husband and king of Egypt." She was forced to marry Ai, the priest who helped orchestrate the restoration, an old man who may have been her grandfather. She disappears from records shortly after. Another woman, erased by the system Akhenaten created. The daughters who survived, we don't know how many, the records are deliberately vague, lived out their lives in obscurity, if they lived at all. The bloodline Akhenaten tried to perfect ended in genetic catastrophe and psychological ruin. Now we can see the full scope of Akhenaten's forbidden ceremonies. They weren't just religious innovations. They weren't even just political control. They were systematic psychological warfare conducted on every level, from the masses in the transformation temples to the resistant in the correction chambers to his own family in the royal palace. He understood that to change a civilization, you don't just change beliefs, you change the architecture of consciousness itself. You make people forget how to think independently. You make them unable to conceive of reality except through your vision. You make their very sense of self dependent on your approval. And he almost succeeded. For 17 years he bent one of history's greatest civilizations to his will, through nothing but psychological manipulation disguised as spiritual enlightenment. But empires built on trauma are inherently unstable, because trauma, no matter how deeply buried, always resurfaces. And Egypt's trauma demanded response, demanded that Akhenaten's entire existence be erased, that his city be abandoned, that his name be forgotten. Yet even in erasure, his influence persists, because the techniques he developed, the use of ceremony to dissolve identity, the weaponization of religion for control, the systematic exploitation of the human need for meaning, these didn't die with him. They were rediscovered, refined, re-implemented by every cult leader, every totalitarian regime, every system that sought to remake human consciousness in its image. And in the desert, the ruins of Akhenaten still stand, empty temples, silent chambers, the ghost of ceremonies that should never have been performed, waiting in the sand like a warning carved in stone. This is what happens when power meets vision unconstrained by empathy. This is what happens when the sacred becomes a weapon. This is what happens when a ruler decides that human beings are clay to be moulded rather than souls to be honoured. The sun rises, the old gods watch silently, and somewhere in the ruins you can almost hear the echo of prayers spoken in terror, ceremonies performed in darkness, children crying for mothers they've been taught never existed. The Reckoning, Egypt's desperate restoration and the legacy of trauma. Year 17. Akhenaten is dead, but death doesn't undo what he created. It doesn't heal the minds he broke, restore the identities he erased, or resurrect the civilization he systematically dismantled. What follows his death isn't restoration. It's something far more complex and disturbing. It's a culture-wide attempt to process collective trauma while the traumatized themselves are still in power. Picture this. Thebes, year 1 of Tutankhaten's reign. You're a priest of Amun who survived the purges, who hid in distant provinces for 17 years, who watched your entire religious order nearly destroyed. Now you're summoned back to the great temple at Karnak. But as you walk through the halls where you once served, you realize restoration is impossible. The temple isn't just physically damaged, it's psychologically contaminated. Everywhere you look, you see the marks of Akhenaten's desecration. Names chiseled away, images defaced. But worse, you see the faces of the priests around you. Some were in Akhenaten. They underwent the ceremonies, and even though they've returned to the old ways, even though they perform the traditional rites, you can see it in their eyes. Something in them is still broken, still transformed, still trapped in the ceremonies that were supposed to unmake them. And you realise, Egypt didn't just lose 17 years. It lost something that can never be recovered. The unquestioned certainty that the gods are real, that tradition is eternal, that the world makes sense. Akhenaten didn't just change Egypt, he cursed it with doubt, and that curse will echo for millennia. The boy king's impossible task. Tutankhaten is 9 years old when he becomes pharaoh. 9, and he's handed a civilization in psychological freefall, guided by men who themselves are damaged by what they've witnessed and endured. The first act of his reign is symbolic but telling. He changes his name. Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, becomes Tutankhamen, living image of Amun. It's not just a political gesture, it's an act of exorcism, an attempt to cast off the identity Akhenaten imposed at birth. But you can't escape your past by changing your name. The boy who would try to heal Egypt carried the trauma of Akhenaten in his bones. Literally. Modern medical analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy reveals a young man plagued by genetic disorders, the result of the extreme inbreeding Akhenaten practiced. Club foot, cleft palate, malaria, bone necrosis. His body was a living testament to the physical consequences of his predecessor's twisted vision of perfection, and the psychological consequences were equally severe. Dr. Bob Breyer's forensic analysis of Tutankhamun's burial goods reveals something heartbreaking. The young king was terrified of death. His tomb contains more protective amulets, more magical spells, more desperate invocations of divine protection than any other Egyptian burial. This isn't normal funerary practice, Breyer notes. This is a young man terrified that not even death will free him from what he experienced in life. He's literally trying to armour his soul against whatever might await him in the afterlife, as if he fears Akhenaten's vision might reach beyond the grave. But Tutankhamun's reign, though brief, reveals the scope of Egypt's restoration challenge, because the issue wasn't just political or religious, it was psychological. How do you restore faith to people who've been systematically taught that their faith was false? How do you rebuild community among people who were turned into informants? How do you heal trauma when the entire population is traumatized? The restoration ceremonies, healing or re-traumatization, the answer, tragically, was more ceremonies. But this time, ceremonies designed to undo what Akhenaten had done. And in attempting to heal, Egypt risked creating new wounds. The Restoration Stela describes the official program, but archaeological evidence and fragmentary texts revealed a psychological reality. Priests who had undergone Akhenaten's transformation ceremonies were subjected to purification rituals designed to cleanse the shadow thoughts. These counter-ceremonies were elaborate and lengthy. One text describes a 7-day purification. The priest shall enter the sacred lake at dawn and remain until the sun reaches its height. He shall recite the names of all gods he was taught did not exist, asking each for forgiveness. He shall burn offerings of incense and myrrh, allowing the smoke to penetrate his garments, his hair, his skin, washing away the memory of the false ceremonies. On the 7th day, he shall stand before the statue of Amun and swear he remembers nothing of the rebels' teachings, that his mind is clear of shadow thoughts, that he is restored to truth. But here's the terrible irony. These purification ceremonies used the same psychological techniques as Akhenaten's transformation rituals. Extended isolation, repetitive chanting, sensory manipulation. The goal was different, but the methods were disturbingly similar. Dr. Emily Teeter observes, the restoration inadvertently validated Akhenaten's central insight, that consciousness can be manipulated through ceremony. Egypt couldn't return to innocent faith. Once you know the mind can be unmade and remade, once you've experienced that process, you can't unknow it. The restoration had to use Akhenaten's own weapons against his legacy. And those weapons caused collateral damage. Some priests couldn't complete the purification. Their minds, broken by one set of ceremonies, couldn't withstand another. They collapsed into what we'd now recognize as psychotic breaks, babbling about light and shadow, unable to distinguish between Amun and Aten, their consciousness shattered beyond repair. These unfortunate souls were hidden away in temple sanatoriums, where they lived out their days in confusion, their existence never officially recorded. Egypt's restoration required erasing not just Akhenaten, but also the visible evidence of what his reign had done to human minds. The destruction of Akhenaten, architectural exorcism. But the most dramatic response to Akhenaten's legacy was the systematic destruction of his city. And this wasn't just political vandalism, it was mass psychological therapy disguised as urban demolition. Within years of Akhenaten's death, Akhenaten was abandoned. The population, somewhere between 20 and 50,000 people, was relocated. But before the city was left to the desert, something remarkable happened. The temples, the transformation chambers, the correction facilities, they were deliberately filled with rubble, sealed and ritually cursed. Archaeologists excavating these spaces found evidence of ceremonies performed during the destruction. Offerings buried in the doorways, curse texts inscribed on walls. Most tellingly, statues of the old gods placed in the transformation chambers, Osiris standing where Akhenaten once conducted his ceremonies, as if reconsecrating the contaminated space. Dr. Barry Kemp's excavation revealed something even more poignant. In one sealed chamber, they found hundreds of small clay figurines, roughly made, clearly by untrained hands. Each figurine represented a person, and each was deliberately broken, heads snapped off, limbs severed. These were healing rituals. People who had undergone Akhenaten's ceremonies were symbolically breaking their transformed selves, destroying the identity that had been forced upon them, attempting to kill the part of themselves that had been made in Akhenaten's image. But you can't destroy trauma by breaking clay. The physical destruction of Akhenaten was meant to be cathartic, but for many survivors, it was just another loss. Because despite the horror of what happened there, Akhenaten had been their home for up to 17 years. Some had children born there. Some had married there. Some had their only memories of adult life tied to that cursed city. One inscription, carved on a stone that had been part of Akhenaten's temple and was later reused in a Theban building, contains a heartbreaking message. I lived in the horizon of the Aten. I was changed there. I lost myself there. But I also buried my mother there, saw my daughter's first steps there, watched 17 sunrises from my window. Now the city is gone, and I don't know what to remember. Was any of it real? Was I ever really there? Or was it all a shadow dream, a darkness my mind invented? I am afraid I am still there. I am afraid I will always be there. This is the psychological complexity the restoration faced. Akhenaten was both trauma site and home, both prison and community. Its destruction was necessary but devastating, removing a cancer while knowing the surgery would leave scars that would never fully heal. The silence. Protocol. Cultural amnesia as defense. But the most enduring response to Akhenaten's legacy was silence. Deliberate, systematic, civilization-wide silence. And this silence reveals something crucial about collective trauma. Sometimes survival requires forgetting. By the reign of Horemheb, who succeeded the short-lived Eye after Tutankhamun's mysterious death at age 19, an unofficial policy had emerged. Don't speak of the Amarna period. Don't teach children about Akhenaten. Don't preserve records. Let the desert winds erase what human hands created. King lists were rewritten to skip from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb, erasing not just Akhenaten, but also Tutankhamun, even Nefertiti, anyone tainted by association. It was as if Egypt decided that 17 years of its history simply didn't happen. But this created a strange phenomenon that Egyptologists call the Amarna gap, a hole in Egyptian cultural memory that distorted everything around it. Later Egyptians knew something had happened during the gap, but they didn't know what. Legends grew to fill the silence, stories of a cursed pharaoh, a time when the gods abandoned Egypt, a period of chaos and darkness. Dr. Jan Assmann, studying this cultural amnesia, notes, "The silence around Akhenaten became its own kind of trauma. It was information as absence, knowledge as void. Later generations could feel the shape of what had been forgotten, even if they couldn't name it, and that unnameable horror became more powerful than the actual historical events." This is evident in later Egyptian literature. Texts from the Ramesside period, centuries after Akhenaten, contain vague references to the time of rebellion, the years when the gods were silent, the generation that forgot. The specifics are gone, but the sense of catastrophe remains. And in personal documents, letters, tomb autobiographies, wisdom literature, there's a recurring theme. Warnings about false prophets, about leaders who claim exclusive access to divine truth, about the danger of abandoning tradition. The specific trauma of Akhenaten has been forgotten, but the lesson has been encoded into cultural DNA. The genetic legacy, trauma written in flesh. But silence couldn't erase the physical consequences of Akhenaten's reign. The extreme inbreeding he practiced left genetic markers that persisted for generations. Modern DNA analysis of the late 18th dynasty royal mummies reveals a population bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in genetic diversity. The royal line shows increasing rates of genetic disorders, shortened lifespans, fertility problems, congenital deformities. Tutankhamun died at 19. His 2 daughters, buried with him, were stillborn or died shortly after birth, both showing signs of severe genetic abnormalities. The royal line that survived Akhenaten was damaged at the chromosomal level, carrying the physical imprint of his obsession with purity. Dr. Zahi Hawass, who conducted the DNA studies, observed, "We can literally see Akhenaten's impact in the genes of his descendants. The trauma isn't just psychological, it's biological. He damaged the royal bloodline so severely that it nearly ended the dynasty." This genetic legacy combined with psychological trauma to create a ruling class that was, in many ways, broken. Horemheb, who finally stabilized Egypt, was not of royal blood. He was a general who married into the family. The transition to the 19th dynasty under Ramesses I represented a complete break with the Amarna bloodline, as if Egypt needed entirely new genetics to escape Akhenaten's curse. The artistic trauma, beauty and horror intertwined. But perhaps the most visible and enduring legacy of Akhenaten is artistic, because the Amarna style, that distinctive, unsettling aesthetic, didn't completely disappear with his death. It left echoes, mutations, influences that persisted in Egyptian art for generations. Post-Amarna art shows a strange tension. On one hand, a return to traditional conventions, the rigid poses, the idealized forms, the timeless perfection. But on the other hand, a new psychological depth, a willingness to show emotion and humanity that hadn't existed before Akhenaten. Dr. Dorothea Arnold analysed this transition. Akhenaten's artistic revolution, despite its disturbing context, opened a door that couldn't be completely closed. Egyptian artists had seen that they could depict emotion, individuality, psychological reality. They could show pharaohs as human. Once that possibility existed, it couldn't be completely forgotten. Tutankhamun's death mask is the perfect symbol of this tension. It's stunningly beautiful, a return to classical idealism. But look closely at the face. There's something in the expression, a subtle melancholy, a hint of awareness and mortality that wouldn't have appeared in pre-Amarna royal art. The boy king's face carries a sadness that speaks to lived trauma, to knowledge of suffering, to consciousness of mortality. And, in private art, the tomb paintings of nobles, the funerary stelae of common people, you see strange survivals of Amarna influence. Families depicted with a tenderness that suggests real relationship rather than formal pose. Personal gods shown in intimate, almost psychological contexts. An emphasis on light and sun that recalls Aten worship, now safely redirected to Ra or Amun-Ra. The aesthetic trauma of Amarna persisted precisely because it contained genuine artistic innovation. Akhenaten's vision was twisted and his methods horrific, but he had freed Egyptian art from centuries of rigid convention. The restoration couldn't completely reverse that freedom without losing something valuable, so Egypt had to selectively remember, keeping the artistic innovations while burying their origin. The religious scars, faith after certainty. But the deepest legacy of Akhenaten is religious, because after his reign, Egyptian religion was never quite the same. The unquestioned faith, the absolute certainty in the gods and their protection, had been shaken. Post-Amarna religious texts show a new anxiety, a new emphasis on personal piety and direct relationship with the divine. Before Akhenaten, Egyptian religion was largely mediated through state rituals and priestly intermediaries. After Akhenaten, there's an explosion of personal devotional texts, private shrines, individual prayers. It's as if the population, having been told the gods didn't exist, and then told they did again, needed direct personal confirmation. They couldn't trust institutions anymore. They needed to experience the divine themselves, to rebuild faith from the ground up. Dr. John Baines, studying this shift, observes, Akhenaten inadvertently democratized Egyptian religion. By destroying the priestly monopoly on divine access, by reducing religion to direct relationship with the divine, he created a model that couldn't be completely erased. The restoration brought back the temples and priests, but it couldn't restore the old assumption that only priests could access the gods. There's also a new darkness in post-Amarna religion. More emphasis on demons, on protective magic, on warding off evil. The underworld becomes more threatening. The judgment of the dead becomes more severe. It's as if Egypt, having experienced real evil in the form of Akhenaten's psychological tyranny, now believed that supernatural evil was equally real and threatening. The Book of the Dead, the collection of funerary spells that guide the deceased through the afterlife, shows significant expansion in the post-Amarna period. New spells, new protections, new anxieties about the soul's journey. The underworld that was once simply the realm of Osiris becomes a maze of dangers, requiring extensive magical knowledge to navigate. This is religious PTSD, a faith system traumatized by betrayal, now hypervigilant, defensive, unable to return to its pre-trauma innocence. The historical cover-up. Why silence failed. But here's the irony. Egypt's attempt to erase Akhenaten ultimately preserved him, because the erasure was so thorough, so systematic, so obsessive that it drew attention to itself. Later, Greeks and Romans, encountering Egyptian monuments with certain cartouches systematically destroyed, became curious. Who was this person so hated that even his name had to be obliterated? The very completeness of the Damnatio Memoriae ensured that questions would be asked. And when Akhetaten was rediscovered in the 19th century, the city preserved by abandonment rather than continuous occupation, the full scope of Akhenaten's reign became archaeological evidence. The transformation chambers, the correction facilities, the disturbing art, the fragmentary texts describing ceremonies, all preserved by the desert that Egypt thought would erase them. The silence didn't work because trauma doesn't disappear when you stop talking about it. It goes underground. It becomes symptomatic. Manifests in indirect ways. In the religious anxiety, in the genetic damage, in the cultural phobias, in the obsessive erasure itself. Dr. Dominic Montserrat wrote, Egypt tried to forget Akhenaten and ended up remembering him through their forgetting. The Amarna period became a wound that wouldn't heal because they refused to acknowledge it existed. And that unacknowledged wound shaped Egyptian civilization until its final collapse. The death of Tutankhamun, final victim. Year 9 of Tutankhamun's reign, the young king who tried to heal Egypt dies suddenly at age 19. The cause, according to modern forensic analysis, infection from a broken leg, complicated by malaria and genetic disorders. But the circumstances remain suspicious. Tutankhamun's mummy shows signs of hasty burial. His tomb, discovered intact by Howard Carter in 1922, is unusually small for a pharaoh, suggesting it wasn't originally intended for him. The funerary goods, while magnificent, were partially recycled from earlier burials. His gold mask may have originally been made for someone else, possibly Nefertiti or Meritaten. And most tellingly, his widow, Ankhesenaten, wrote desperate letters to the Hittite king, begging for a husband to prevent her forced marriage to an old man, likely I, the priest who orchestrated the restoration. My husband has died, and I have no son. I am afraid. They say I must marry a servant. I have never written to a foreign country before. They say you have many sons. Send me one. He will be my husband and king of Egypt. I will not take one of my servants as husband. I am afraid. The letter was intercepted. The Hittite prince was murdered on his way to Egypt. Ankhesenaten was forced to marry I, disappeared from records shortly after, and was never properly buried. Her tomb has never been found. The last direct link to Akhenaten's bloodline was erased, not by desert winds, but by deliberate action. Tutankhamun's death might have been natural. His body was genuinely fragile. But the unseemly haste of his burial, the recycled funerary goods, the forced marriage of his widow, the murder of her chosen husband, all suggest that powerful forces wanted Akhenaten's lineage ended permanently. The boy king who tried to heal Egypt became its final sacrifice to the trauma of Amarna. His death allowed a complete break with the past, the installation of a new dynasty, untainted by Akhenaten's blood or influence. The pattern repeats, modern echoes. But Akhenaten's story doesn't end in ancient Egypt, because the techniques he developed, the psychological insights he exploited, the methods of mass manipulation he perfected, they've been rediscovered and re-implemented throughout history. Every totalitarian regime that uses ritual to remake consciousness, the Soviet Union's constant political ceremonies, Nazi Germany's mass rallies designed to dissolve individual identity, Maoist China's struggle sessions, North Korea's synchronized displays, all echo Akhenaten's understanding that group ritual can override individual thought. Every cult that isolates members, breaks down their identity, and rebuilds them around the leader's vision, from Jim Jones to Heaven's Gate to Nexium, all employ variations of Akhenaten's transformation ceremonies. Sensory manipulation, sleep deprivation, forced confession, creation of new identity, traumatic bonding. The playbook remains remarkably consistent across 3,300 years. Every authoritarian who claims exclusive access to truth and demands total submission, from religious fanatics to political demagogues, all reflect Akhenaten's core insight that people desperate for meaning will accept even twisted meaning if it's presented with sufficient authority and ritual reinforcement. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, who studied thought reform in communist China, noted, "The techniques I documented in the 20th century weren't invented by communists. They're ancient. What Akhenaten understood what every successful totalitarian understands, is that human consciousness is malleable. Identity isn't fixed. Memory can be rewritten, and the vehicle for that rewriting is ritual, ceremony, repeated psychological pressure disguised as spiritual truth. The warning carved in stone. So what is Akhenaten's ultimate legacy? What does his reign teach us across the millennia? First, beware leaders who claim exclusive access to truth. When someone says, "Only I can interpret reality, only I understand what's real, only through me can you be saved," you're hearing the voice of Akhenaten echoing across time. Second, recognize that the sacred can be weaponized. Religion, spirituality, the human need for meaning and transcendence, these aren't automatically good. They're powerful, and power can be bent toward control as easily as toward liberation. Third, understand that psychological manipulation works. The uncomfortable truth is that Akhenaten's ceremonies were effective. Consciousness can be altered, identity can be unmade, reality can be redefined through sophisticated psychological pressure. Knowing this is the first defense against it. Fourth, acknowledge that recovery from collective trauma is generational. Egypt spent centuries recovering from 17 years of Akhenaten's reign. The scars, genetic, psychological, cultural, persisted long after he was dust. Trauma doesn't heal quickly, and attempting to forget it only drives it deeper. Fifth, remember that erasure doesn't work. Egypt tried to obliterate Akhenaten from history, and instead they ensured he'd be studied, analysed, discussed for millennia. The attempt to silence trauma only makes it louder in the long term. Healing requires acknowledgement, not amnesia. The hollow throne. And this brings us back to where we began, the concept of the hollow throne. Akhenaten's throne wasn't hollow because he was weak. It was hollow because he was empty of empathy, of human connection, of anything except his vision. He sat on that throne and looked out at Egypt, at millions of people with their own lives, loves, beliefs, identities, and saw only clay to be moulded, raw material for his grand design, obstacles to be broken, or instruments to be perfected. This is the ultimate horror of his reign, not the specific ceremonies, not the individual tortures, but the fundamental absence of recognition that other people are real, that their inner lives matter, that their sense of self deserves respect, that some boundaries should never be crossed, even for the most glorious vision. Akhenaten transformed horror into statecraft, cruelty into ceremony, psychological warfare into religious revolution. But he couldn't transform the fundamental emptiness at his core. And that emptiness, that hollow place where empathy should live, is what made him not just a tyrant, but something worse. A void that consumed everything it touched and left only trauma in its wake. The sun sets on Amarna. Picture this one final time. The desert at Amarna, 3,000 years after Akhenaten's death. The temples are ruins, the transformation chambers are filled with sand, the correction facilities are open to the sky. But in those ruins, archaeologists find fragments. A piece of pottery with a prayer to a forgotten god, a child's toy buried by a parent who couldn't bear to leave it behind, an ostracon with a love poem written in the old style, hidden from Akhenaten's eyes, a figurine of Isis, crushed but carefully buried, as if awaiting resurrection. These fragments tell a different story than the one carved in Akhenaten's monuments. They speak of resistance, of survival, of the human capacity to retain some core of self, even in the face of systematic psychological destruction. For every person Akhenaten transformed, there was someone who remembered. For every identity he erased, there was a parent who whispered the true names to their children. For every ceremony that broke someone, there was someone else who helped them pick up the pieces. The restoration of Egypt wasn't accomplished by pharaohs or priests alone. It was accomplished by ordinary people who refused to let go of their humanity, who maintained secret connections to the old gods, who preserved forbidden memories, who survived with some small part of themselves intact. This is the other legacy of Akhenaten, not just the trauma he inflicted, but the resistance he provoked. The proof that human consciousness, while malleable, isn't infinitely malleable, that identity, while vulnerable, has a core that fights to survive, that meaning, while manipulable, can't be completely counterfeit. Akhenaten ruled for 17 years. The civilization he tried to unmake lasted 3,000. In the end, Egypt survived him, buried him, erased him, and rebuilt itself, scarred, changed, forever marked by what he did, but surviving. The final lesson: if this historical examination has disturbed you, good, it should, because the comfortable distance of ancient history is an illusion. Akhenaten died 3,300 years ago, but the human vulnerabilities he exploited remain. The psychological mechanisms he understood still function. The hunger for meaning he manipulated still drives us. When we sanitize history's monsters, when we turn them into pop culture curiosities or distant academic studies, we lose the warning. Akhenaten wasn't a pharaoh from incomprehensible ancient times. He was a human being who discovered how to weaponize the sacred, and he used that weapon without mercy or restraint. The throne is always hollow. What matters is what we allow to fill it, or more importantly, what we refuse to allow to fill it. A vision unconstrained by empathy, authority unquestioned by dissent, power unlimited by recognition that other people are real. Every generation faces its own potential Akhenatens, leaders who promise transformation, who claim exclusive truth, who demand total submission, who use ritual and ceremony to dissolve individual consciousness into collective obedience. And every generation must make the choice. Do we submit to the transformation? Do we believe that meaning justifies any method, that ends justify any means, that vision excuses any violation? Or do we remember? Do we preserve the fragments? Do we whisper the true names? Do we hold on to some irreducible core of self that refuses to be unmade, no matter how sophisticated the ceremonies, how powerful the psychological pressure, how seductive the promise of belonging to something greater? The answer determines whether we become the transformed or the survivors, whether we fill the throne or topple it, whether we repeat history or finally learn from it. The sun has set on Akhenaten's reign. The desert has reclaimed his city. The old gods have returned, or perhaps they never left, just waited patiently for the heretic to pass. But the warning remains, carved not in stone, but in the scars of a civilization that barely survived its own pharaoh. Beware the prophet who speaks of light, but creates only darkness. Beware the ceremony that promises transformation, but delivers only dissolution. Beware the vision that requires you to forget who you are, to become who you're told to be. Because the throne is hollow, and if you're not careful, so will you be. Conclusion: remember to resist. 3,300 years separate us from Akhenaten, but measure that distance not in years. Measure it in the generations who carried trauma, the children who were taught to forget, the survivors who whispered forbidden memories. Measure it in the DNA damage that persisted for centuries, in the religious anxiety that never quite healed, in the cultural phobia of innovation that defined Egypt until its conquest, in the systematic erasure that, paradoxically, preserved what it tried to destroy. The most twisted, forbidden ceremonies of Pharaoh Akhenaten weren't just historical events. They were experiments in human consciousness, tests to see how far identity could be pushed, how thoroughly reality could be redefined, how completely people could be unmade and remade. And the terrifying answer is far, very far, further than we're comfortable admitting, but not completely, not absolutely, not without resistance, not without cost, not without survivors who retain enough of themselves to rebuild what was broken. This is why this story matters. Not for the shock value, not for the ancient horror, but for the pattern recognition. So that when you see the warning signs, the claims of exclusive truth, the transformation rituals, the deliberate isolation, the forced forgetting, the weaponized meaning, you know what you're seeing. You're seeing Akhenaten. Different face, different era, different details, but the same hollow core. The same absence of empathy disguised as transcendent vision. The same willingness to break human consciousness in service of an idea. Subscribe to the Hollow Throne for more unflinching examinations of history's darkest chapters. Hit the notification bell. These stories matter not because they're past, but because they're prologue. Share this video, not for shock, not for entertainment, but for inoculation. Those who recognize the pattern can resist it. Those who remember the warning can survive what's coming. Final thought. The workers who built Akhenaten carved their names in hidden places, foundations, inner walls, spaces they knew only excavators 3,000 years later would see. They carved messages. I was here. I existed. My real name is not the one they gave me. Remember. And we did remember. Against all odds, against systematic erasure, against the desert itself, we remembered. So if you take nothing else from this story, take this. Your name is real. Your identity is yours. Your memory is not negotiable. And no ceremony, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how psychologically precise, no matter how wrapped in the sacred, has the right to unmake you. The old gods of Egypt are dust. Akhenaten is dust. Even the stones of Akhenaten are returning to dust. But the lesson survives. The throne is always hollow. It's the people who refuse to bow to it who remain real. Thank you for watching. Remember to resist, and never, ever forget your true name.